Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The content provided in this video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute professional legal, financial, agricultural, or psychological advice. Marital dissolution, asset division, and family law vary significantly by state and local jurisdiction. If you or someone you know is navigating these challenges, it is essential to conduct your own due diligence and consult with a licensed family law attorney, a certified financial planner, or a qualified mental health professional in your specific area. When we think about the breakdown of a marriage in the United States, the cultural imagery that often comes to mind is deeply metropolitan. We picture high-rise law firms in Manhattan, the swift division of suburban real estate, or individuals disappearing into the total anonymity of a major city to start their lives over from scratch. But there is an entirely different, far more complex reality unfolding across the geographic expanse of the American heartland. In the rural communities that make up the vast majority of the U.S. landmass, the end of a marriage is never just a private legal transaction between two people. It is a seismic event that threatens the economic survival of multi-generational family enterprises, disrupts deeply entrenched kinship networks, and forces individuals to navigate the excruciating process of separation under the intense, inescapable microscope of small-town surveillance. Case studies from across the rural Midwest and the American South reveal that when a couple decides to part ways in a community of fewer than 1,000 people, the social and economic consequences ripple outward in ways that urban dwellers can scarcely comprehend. Imagine a scenario where the breakdown of your relationship does not just mean splitting a bank account, but potentially forcing the liquidation of a 400-acre family farm that has been passed down through your family since the Homestead Act. Imagine trying to heal from a deeply painful emotional betrayal when the only grocery store within a 40-mile radius is managed by your spouse's first cousin, and your local pastor is the individual who performed your wedding ceremony 15 years ago. This is the stark, unvarnished reality of the rural divorce journey, a phenomenon dictated by geographic isolation, structural scarcity, and ancient cultural mandates that continue to govern the American countryside. This video serves as a comprehensive sociological masterclass designed to unpack the invisible structural forces that dictate relationships outside of major metropolitan areas. For the American audience watching today, understanding this dynamic solves a critical blind spot in our cultural conversation. It strips away the romanticized myth of the unbroken, idyllic rural family and replaces it with a rigorous, data-driven analysis of how economic shifts, legal deserts, and social pressures impact real human lives. Whether you are currently navigating a complex family transition yourself, trying to understand the pressures facing rural relatives, or seeking a deeper understanding of the socioeconomic fractures within modern America, this deep dive provides the analytical framework necessary to comprehend the unique challenges of rural marital dissolution. Over this multi-part study, we will explore the precise mechanics of asset division in resource-dependent economies, the psychological toll of public-facing family displacement, and the systematic ways rural institutions adapt to or penalize those who choose to leave. To fully understand why the rural divorce journey is so uniquely challenging, we must first examine the foundational pillar of rural life: extreme economic interdependence. In a metropolitan economy, most individuals sell their labor to corporations, healthcare systems, or government entities. Their income is distinct from their home, and their home is distinct from their extended family. If a divorce occurs, a judge can look at a W-2 form, evaluate the equity in a suburban property, and execute a clean mathematical division of assets. In an agricultural or resource-dependent rural community, however, historical trends show that wealth is rarely liquid. It is tied directly to the land, heavy machinery, livestock, or a localized family-owned business. Consider the case studies of family farms in states like Iowa, Nebraska, or Illinois. In these environments, a marriage is not merely a romantic partnership. It is a sophisticated, highly integrated economic joint venture. The farm operations often involve not just the husband and wife, but parents, siblings, and nieces or nephews. The land itself may be held in a complex web of family-limited partnerships or trusts, designed to preserve the acreage for future generations. When a marriage within this ecosystem destabilizes, the potential outcomes are catastrophic for the entire extended family unit. If a court mandates a standard 50-50 split of marital property, the cash-poor but asset-rich couple may be forced to sell off critical parcels of land or expensive machinery to satisfy the judgment. This does not just impact the divorcing couple. It systematically degrades the viability of the entire family business, threatening the livelihoods of multiple generations who had no direct part in the marital breakdown. Consequently, the pressure exerted on a struggling couple to stay together for the sake of the family enterprise is immense, creating a profound sociological environment where personal happiness is routinely sacrificed at the altar of economic survival. Beyond the macroeconomic pressures, we must analyze the profound psychological weight of what sociologists refer to as community surveillance, or the total absence of anonymity. In a densely populated urban center, an individual experiencing a divorce can easily retreat into the background. They can change their social circles, frequent new establishments, and rebuild their identity without facing constant reminders of their past. In a rural community, the built environment offers no such luxury. There are no third spaces that are truly neutral. The local diner, the high school football stadium, the feed store, and the county courthouse are all arenas of intense social scrutiny. When a couple separates in a small town, the gossip economy acts as an informal but highly potent regulatory mechanism. Every community member becomes an observer and, frequently, a partisan participant in the marital dispute. Historical trends indicate that this lack of privacy disproportionately penalizes women in traditional rural environments. Because rural communities often retain more patriarchal social structures, a woman initiating a divorce may find herself subtly or overtly ostracized by local civic organizations, church groups, and even local business owners who maintain deep-seated loyalties to her husband's family line. The social friction this creates is intense. Every trip to the post office or the school pickup line becomes a high-stakes psychological confrontation, forcing individuals to constantly manage their public presentation of self while navigating deep personal grief. This level of sustained social stress frequently leads to a phenomenon known as voluntary migration, where one party is ultimately forced to abandon their hometown entirely, sacrificing their geographic heritage and their local support network simply to find a space where they can breathe and reinvent themselves without judgment. This structural displacement highlights a critical, systemic vulnerability within the rural geographic framework, the phenomenon known as legal deserts. In major American cities, the legal market is oversaturated. A person seeking a divorce can choose from hundreds of family law specialists, selecting an attorney who aligns perfectly with their financial constraints and strategic goals. In vast regions of rural America, however, the legal landscape is an absolute wasteland. Data from across the American heartland reveals that a staggering percentage of rural counties have fewer than 5 practicing attorneys, and many have none at all. Let us look at a concrete case study unfolding in the current year of 2026 to see exactly how this structural crisis plays out in real time. Consider a couple named Robert and Becky, who have spent 15 years building a life in a remote agricultural county in western Kansas. When their marriage fractures due to deep-seated incompatibility and financial strain, Becky realizes she must seek formal legal counsel to protect her interests and those of her 2 children. She opens a directory only to discover that within her entire county, there are only 2 practicing attorneys who handle family law matters. The first attorney is a lifelong friend of Robert's father and has handled the family's agricultural estate planning for decades, creating an immediate, insurmountable conflict of interest. The second attorney has already been retained by Robert earlier that same week. This places Becky in an immediate, terrifying structural trap. To secure a family law attorney who can represent her without a conflict of interest, she is forced to look outside her county, identifying a counsel located in a larger regional hub over 90 miles away. This geographical distance is not just an inconvenience. It is an active economic penalty. Every single consultation, every strategy meeting, and every document signing requires a 3-hour round-trip drive. Although digital communication and remote video conferencing have expanded by 2026, rural family law courts routinely mandate in-person appearances for crucial temporary order hearings, custody evaluations, and mediation sessions. The logistical friction of this arrangement is immense. Becky must secure childcare, arrange for time off from her hourly employment at the regional medical clinic, and absorb the escalating costs of fuel and vehicle maintenance. If she cannot afford this constant drain on her limited resources, the potential outcomes shift dramatically against her. Historical trends demonstrate that the spouse with fewer independent financial assets is frequently forced into a position of legal submission, accepting an inequitable, substandard settlement simply because they lack the physical and financial mobility required to sustain a long-distance legal battle in a legal desert. This logistical nightmare is immediately compounded by another severe, often overlooked crisis: the absolute scarcity of rural housing. Imagine if you make the agonizing decision to separate from your spouse, but find that there is literally nowhere for you to physically go within your community. In a major metropolitan area, a separating couple can leverage a fluid, highly dynamic real estate market. One partner can quickly sign a short-term lease on an apartment, move into a condominium, or find a temporary sublet within a 15-mile radius, allowing the children to remain in their schools and minimizing day-to-day disruption. In rural America, the housing stock is notoriously rigid and stagnant. Most rural communities consist almost exclusively of single-family homes that are passed down through generations or owned long-term. There are rarely multifamily apartment complexes, townhomes, or rental units available. If Robert remains in the marital home because it sits on the primary parcel of the family ranch, Becky faces an immediate, existential housing crisis. With zero local rental options on the market, her choices are narrowed down to a few deeply flawed options. She can choose to remain under the same roof as an estranged spouse, a scenario that case studies show breeds immense psychological hostility, chronic stress for the children, and a heightened potential for domestic escalation. Alternatively, she can move back into her parents' home if they live nearby. However, this move instantly signals the marital failure to the entire community, accelerating the intrusive local surveillance and small-town gossip economy. The final option is to pack up and move to the regional hub city 90 miles away where rental housing is available. But taking this step means uprooting her children from their school district, abandoning her local employment, and severing her immediate support network. Furthermore, moving the children across county lines prior to a formal temporary custody order can be weaponized against her in court, where Robert's attorney could frame the move as an unstable, unilateral relocation that disrupts the status quo of the children's lives. When an individual faces these overwhelming pressures in an urban center, they can typically lean on a dense, institutionalized social safety net. Cities feature nonprofit legal aid clinics, state-funded family advocacy groups, secular support networks, and a wide array of mental health professionals. In the rural matrix, this safety net is virtually non-existent. Decades of economic stagnation have resulted in the systematic closure of rural social services. If Becky or her children require psychological counseling to cope with the trauma of a high-conflict separation, the nearest licensed child psychologist or family therapist may have a 6-month waiting list or require a drive across multiple county lines. Consequently, the only surviving institution capable of providing support in many small towns is the local church. While religious communities can offer profound spiritual comfort, historical trends highlight a dark systemic mismatch when it comes to marital dissolution. In traditional rural congregations, pastoral counseling is frequently rooted in theological doctrines that prioritize the preservation of the marriage contract at all costs, often viewing divorce as a moral failure rather than a necessary legal solution to an untenable situation. An individual seeking guidance from a local pastor is often met with intense pressure to reconcile, forgive, and endure, a dynamic that systematically invalidates their experiences of emotional neglect or financial control. The vulnerable spouse finds themselves isolated not just geographically, but institutionally, gaslit by the very community mechanisms that are supposed to offer refuge. This lack of institutional neutrality extends directly into the rural judicial system itself. In a major metropolitan court system, cases are assigned randomly to judges who have absolutely no personal connection to the litigants. The proceedings are clinical, anonymous, and strictly bound by the paperwork presented. In a rural circuit court, the local judge is often a prominent fixture of the community. They eat at the same local diners, attend the same high school athletic events, and possess an intimate, decades-long knowledge of the local families and their reputations. This total absence of judicial anonymity can subtly and profoundly warp potential outcomes. If a family name carries immense historical weight, economic power, or philanthropic influence within the county, a local judge may carry an unconscious bias toward preserving that family's local legacy and economic assets. A spouse who is viewed as an outsider, or who is seen as the catalyst for dismantling a respected local family unit, faces an uphill battle against an entrenched social hierarchy that extends from the town square right up to the judge's bench. The legal system, which projects an image of blind justice, becomes deeply entangled with the preservation of local stability and traditional norms. Every asset evaluation, every custody recommendation, and every temporary support order is filtered through a hyper-localized lens that favors the status quo. The rural divorce journey is therefore revealed to be an intricate, multi-layered trap where geography, economics, law, and social architecture all conspire to penalize the individual who dares to break the marital bond. But what happens when the legal battle moves past the initial separation and into the actual brutal calculation of the assets themselves? How do you divide an inheritance made of dirt, equipment, and debt without destroying the livelihood of everyone involved? In the next part of this masterclass, we will expose the hidden financial architecture of rural marriages, uncovering the weaponization of agricultural debt, the secret valuation traps of multi-generational land trusts, and the precise legal maneuvers used to isolate vulnerable spouses from the wealth they helped build. To map the precise mechanics of this financial isolation, we must look at the structural reality of modern agricultural capital in the current year of 2026. In urban divorce scenarios, the primary asset is typically a home with clear market value and liquid retirement accounts. In rural America, wealth is overwhelmingly illiquid, heavily leveraged, and deliberately wrapped in defensive legal structures designed to resist fragmentation. When a marriage dissolves in this environment, the division of property transforms from a standard accounting exercise into a high-stakes financial war, where asset valuation and debt allocation are weaponized to protect the lineage of the land. Consider the highly sophisticated weaponization of agricultural debt, a tactic frequently observed in modern rural case studies. Imagine a scenario involving a couple, John and Sarah, who have spent 2 decades managing a large-scale grain operation in Nebraska. To the outside observer, and to the community at large, they appear immensely wealthy. They operate millions of dollars worth of combines, tractors, and GPS-guided irrigation systems. They manage thousands of acres of highly productive soil. However, the foundational vulnerability of this enterprise lies in its reliance on massive, cyclical operating lines of credit. Every single spring, the operation must secure a multi-$100,000 loan from a local agricultural lender just to purchase seed, fertilizer, fuel, and chemical inputs. The entire livelihood of the family is contingent upon the assumption that the fall harvest will generate enough revenue to pay off the operating note, leaving a narrow margin of profit to sustain the household and service long-term equipment debt. When John and Sarah enter the divorce process, John's legal counsel can leverage this massive debt load to completely alter the perceived valuation of the marital estate. By timing the divorce filing to coincide with the peak of the operating debt cycle, right before the harvest revenue is realized, the marital balance sheet can be made to look functionally insolvent. On paper, the liabilities of the farm temporarily eclipse its liquid assets. John can argue that forcing a division of capital or mandating a cash buyout for Sarah would jeopardize the operating line of credit, causing the local bank to call the loan and push the entire family enterprise into bankruptcy. Sarah is then placed in an impossible position. If she insists on a comprehensive valuation and a fair distribution of the marital property, she is framed by the farm's creditors and John's extended family as an existential threat to the economic survival of the business and, by extension, the inheritance of her own children. Historical trends indicate that many vulnerable spouses, overwhelmed by the fear of causing a systemic financial collapse that would alienate them from their children and community, agree to waive their rights to the equity of the land, walking away with nothing more than a modest, short-term alimony payment that fails to reflect decades of shared labor. This manipulation of debt is directly linked to the hidden valuation traps embedded within multi-generational land trusts and closely held family corporations. In the vast majority of traditional farming families, the land does not belong to the individual couple. Long before John and Sarah were married, the family patriarchs established sophisticated legal entities, such as a family limited partnership or a multi-generational LLC, to shield the acreage from external liabilities and estate taxes. The land is deeded directly to the entity, and John may only own a minority percentage of shares within that entity, while his parents and siblings retain the controlling interest. When a divorce court attempts to evaluate John's net worth for the purposes of asset division, Sarah's legal team encounters an insurmountable legal wall. Because John is a minority shareholder in a family-controlled entity, his shares lack marketability. A forensic accountant cannot simply value the land at its current market rate per acre and divide it by John's percentage of ownership. Instead, defense attorneys routinely apply massive valuation discounts, often ranging from 20% to 40%, based on the legal principles of lack of control and lack of marketability. The argument presented to the court is simple. Because John cannot unilaterally force the sale of the land, and because there is no public market for shares in a private family farm, his ownership interest is fundamentally illiquid and virtually worthless on the open market. Consequently, A tract of land worth $10 million on the open market is valued at a fraction of that amount within the context of the divorce proceeding, systematically stripping Sarah of the true economic value of the asset base she helped cultivate. This structural devaluation is further exacerbated by the severe labor valuation disconnect that characterizes rural marital economies. For 20 years, Sarah may have worked full-time on the operation, performing essential but uncompensated tasks that kept the business solvent. She managed the farm's complex bookkeeping, coordinated parts runs during the chaotic harvest season, prepared meals for large work crews, and managed the household, allowing John to focus exclusively on field operations. In a standard corporate environment, this labor would be recognized through a salary, payroll records, and retirement contributions. In the informal, family-centric structure of an agricultural enterprise, this contribution is categorized as non-monetary sweat equity. When the marriage ends, the legal system struggles to assign a concrete financial value to this multifaceted domestic and operational labor. Because Sarah was never an official employee of the family LLC and never received a W-2 form, her decades of work are often minimized by defense experts as the expected duties of a supportive farm spouse rather than a direct contribution to the acquisition of marital wealth. The court often views the appreciation of the farm's value during the marriage not as a joint achievement, but as the natural byproduct of market forces and the capital investments made by John's family line. Sarah is effectively reclassified from a co-founder of an enterprise into a dependent outsider, facing potential outcomes where her financial future is completely unmoored from the multi-million-dollar asset base she sacrificed her career trajectory to build. Every single point of this financial architecture is designed to protect the integrity of the soil and the continuity of the patriarchal lineage at the absolute expense of the departing spouse. The legal maneuvers are precise, calculated, and deeply embedded in the statutory frameworks of agricultural states. The vulnerable spouse find themselves fighting not just their partner, but an entire historical apparatus of asset protection that views them as a temporary participant in a permanent family legacy. They are forced to watch as complex depreciation schedules, equipment liens, and entity restrictions are systematically deployed to erase their financial identity, leaving them with minimal capital to rebuild a life in an economy that offers few alternative avenues for wealth generation. Yet, as devastating as this financial liquidation is, it represents only the material half of the rural divorce journey. The true battleground often shifts from the balance sheet of the family farm to the custody and emotional stewardship of the children. How do you co-parent when the distance between your homes is measured not in blocks, but in counties? How do you shield your children from a small-town rumor mill when their teachers, coaches, and peers are all active participants in the community's social hierarchy? In the next part of this masterclass, we will step inside the deeply fraught world of rural custody battles, examining the geographic weaponization of school district lines, the profound isolation of long-distance visitation schedules, and the systematic ways local community institutions are used to alienate the parent who chooses to walk away. This institutional weaponization manifests most acutely in the geographic battle over school district lines, a conflict that forces a structural redesign of parental rights. In a metropolitan area, a joint physical custody arrangement with an alternating week schedule is easily sustained because the parents typically remain within the same metropolitan ecosystem. In the vast spaces of rural America, the geography of isolation makes this arrangement completely impossible. Let us examine a highly detailed case study unfolding in the current year of 2026 to see exactly how these geographic barriers dictate potential outcomes. Consider a couple, David and Emily, who are terminating their marriage in a remote ranching community in Wyoming. David retains ownership of the multi-generational livestock operation, while Emily, facing the severe housing scarcity within the immediate county, is forced to relocate to a larger regional center 65 miles away to find an affordable two-bedroom apartment and secure full-time employment. They share 2 children, aged 8 and 11. Under the prevailing state statutes, a child's primary school enrollment is tethered directly to the physical address of their primary residential custodian. David's legal counsel immediately leverages this statutory framework by filing a motion for temporary custody, arguing that maintaining the children in their current rural school district is paramount for their psychological stability and academic continuity. The argument presented to the court is deeply compelling to a rural judge. The children are deeply integrated into the local community. They participate in the county 4-H programs, they are members of the local youth rodeo association, and their entire extended paternal family resides within a 10-mile radius of the ranch. The geographic reality dictates that a 65-mile distance between parents completely eliminates the possibility of a shared physical custody schedule. The children cannot spend 3 hours every single day traversing rural 2-lane highways on a school bus, an ordeal that would be physically exhausting and academically detrimental. Furthermore, during the harsh winter months, these rural routes are routinely impacted by severe blizzards, black ice, and drifting snow, rendering long-distance commuting an active safety hazard. Consequently, the court is forced by the sheer geography of the landscape to choose one primary residential parent. Historical trends demonstrate that courts heavily favor the status quo of the rural environment, meaning Emily is systematically relegated to a non-custodial status, receiving visitation rights restricted to alternating weekends and major school holidays. This legal designation transforms every single custody exchange into a high-stress, logistically complex operation that places an immense financial and physical burden on the non-custodial parent. Imagine a scenario where every alternating Friday afternoon requires a 130-mile round-trip drive along isolated highways just to execute a weekend drop-off. Because there are no neutral, staff custody exchange centers in these remote regions, the transition must take place in public parking lots, frequently at a highway gas station or a grocery store located at the midpoint between the two towns. These exchanges occur under the stark, unyielding glare of public spaces, where any delay due to vehicle maintenance issues, agricultural traffic, or inclement weather can be immediately documented by the custodial parent and weaponized in subsequent court hearings as evidence of instability or parental irresponsibility. The financial cost of this constant transit, including escalating fuel expenses, vehicle depreciation, and lost wages from hourly employment, acts as a continuous economic drain on Emily, eroding her capacity to build long-term financial security in her new environment. Once this geographic separation is locked into a legal decree, local community institutions cease to function as neutral support systems and instead transform into instruments of active social alienation. In a small rural town, the local school district is not merely an educational facility. It is the absolute cultural and social epicenter of the community. The administrators, teachers, school board members, and athletic coaches are all deeply intertwined with the local social hierarchy. If David's family has farmed the area for a century and holds significant social capital, the institutional bias within the school system shifts heavily in his direction. When Emily attempts to maintain an active role in her children's educational lives, she encounters a chilling systemic wall of exclusion. School administrative systems in rural areas are frequently slow to adapt to complex co-parenting realities. Despite federal regulations mandating equal access to educational records, Emily may find herself routinely left off email distribution lists for report cards, disciplinary notices, and parent-teacher conferences. When she attends a school function, such as a Friday night basketball game or a school play, the physical layout of the rural high school gymnasium offers no anonymity. She must sit alone, separated from the tight-knit network of local parents who have already coalesced around David, enduring covert glances and hushed conversations that reinforce her status as an outsider who abandoned the community fabric. This institutional alienation extends seamlessly into the realm of youth sports and rural extracurricular traditions. In agricultural communities, participation in events like the county fair or livestock competitions is a monumental milestone for children, requiring months of collaborative family labor. When a non-custodial parent is geographically excluded from the daily preparation of these projects, their ability to participate in the final event is systematically undermined. If Emily cannot drive the 65 miles on a Tuesday afternoon to help her son groom his steer for the local show, David and his extended family absorb that role entirely. When the competition day arrives, David is positioned as the dedicated, present ranching father, while Emily's arrival from the city is viewed by the community as a superficial, disruptive appearance. The local social network actively validates David's narrative, internalizing the belief that the parent who left the geographic boundaries of the town has fundamentally abandoned their commitment to the heritage and values of the community. Over time, this constant social pressure chips away at the children's own perceptions, as they are subjected to a continuous stream of subtle reinforcement from peers, coaches, and relatives suggesting that their mother's new life in the regional city is disconnected from who they are meant to be. The psychological consequence of this institutional alignment is a profound identity fracture within the children themselves. They are forced to navigate two entirely incompatible sociological matrices: the traditional, high-surveillance, resource-dependent world of their father's ranch, and the modern, anonymous, service-driven world of their mother's urban apartment. The children quickly learn to compartmentalize their behavior, their language, and their loyalties, recognizing that expressing affection for the non-custodial parent within the rural community is viewed as a form of betrayal. This silent emotional burden is carried entirely by the youth, who possess no vocabulary to articulate how the very institutions designed to nurture them are actively utilized to erase the presence of the parent who walked away. But the ramifications of this domestic warfare extend far beyond the psychological trauma inflicted on a single family unit. When hundreds of these microcrises occur simultaneously across the American heartland, they begin to fundamentally alter the macrodemographic and economic survival of rural society itself. What happens to the long-term viability of small towns when an entire class of displaced, non-custodial individuals is systematically purged from the landscape? In the next part of this masterclass, we will shift our analytical lens from the individual family unit to the wider sociological landscape, exposing the hidden demographic collapse triggered by rural marital dissolution, the accelerating flight of female labor from the countryside, and the ultimate transformation of the American rural community into a monoculture of aging, isolated populations. This demographic shift is not a slow, natural evolution. It is a rapid structural purging of vital human capital from the American countryside. Historical trends show that rural counties across the United States have been fighting a losing battle against youth outmigration for decades, a phenomenon widely analyzed as the brain drain. However, modern sociology has largely ignored how marital dissolution acts as a silent, high-velocity catalyst for this exact demographic collapse. When a rural marriage fails, it does not simply result in two separate households within the same zip code. It routinely triggers a geographical exit that permanently destabilizes the local economy and alters the population structure for generations. To understand the mechanics of this collapse, we must analyze the flight of female labor, which is often the first and most damaging domino to fall. Imagine if a rural community loses its only advanced practice registered nurse, its primary high school mathematics teacher, or its certified public accountant, not because of a corporate recruitment campaign, but because of a broken marriage. In the current year of 2026, we see this exact scenario playing out in the life of a woman named Megan, a 34-year-old speech-language pathologist working across 3 rural school districts in West Texas. Megan's career is highly specialized and desperately needed in an underserved area where children with developmental delays often wait months for state-funded interventions. She initially moved to this remote county 8 years ago after marrying a local cotton farmer, embedding her specialized skills into the community fabric. When her marriage ends, the combined weight of the structural barriers we have explored, the legal desert, the total lack of multifamily housing, and the relentless surveillance of the local gossip network, makes staying in the county completely untenable for her. When Megan packs her vehicle and relocates to a larger regional hub city like Lubbock or Amarillo, the community does not just lose a resident, it loses a critical piece of its foundational infrastructure. In the rural United States, professional service positions in healthcare, education, and social administration are disproportionately occupied by women, many of whom entered these communities due to a marital connection to a local agriculturalist or resource worker. When the marriage fails, the primary anchor keeping that professional labor in the community is severed. The potential outcomes of this systemic flight are severe. School districts struggle to recruit replacements because young, single professionals are deeply hesitant to move into known legal and housing deserts. Rural medical clinics are forced to reduce their hours, increase patient wait times, or close their doors entirely, forcing elderly residents to travel even further for basic medical care. The loss of a single professional woman in a town of 1,500 people creates a vacancy that can remain unfilled for years, systematically degrading the quality of life for every single individual who remains. This gender-skewed outmigration accelerates a profound demographic distortion, transforming entire zip codes into an aging, masculine monoculture. Case studies from the rural Upper Midwest and the Great Plains reveal a stark imbalance in the demographic pyramid of counties heavily impacted by agricultural consolidation and high rates of post-divorce relocation. The individuals who remain are predominantly older men who hold the deeds to the land, alongside the aging laborers who service the heavy machinery and infrastructure. The younger, college-educated female demographic is systematically drained from the environment. This creates a compounding crisis for the long-term survival of the community. With a critical shortage of women of reproductive age, local birth rates experience a precipitous, irreversible decline. As the birth rate plummets, the local school district, already strained by the geographic warfare of custody disputes, faces an existential threat from declining enrollment. In 2026, state education funding models remain tightly tethered to average daily attendance figures. When a handful of divorced parents relocate their children to regional cities, the local school loses vital state funding. This triggers a cascading collapse. Elective programs are cut, advanced placement classes are eliminated, athletic teams are forced to consolidate with rival towns 30 miles away, and eventually, the state mandates the total closure and consolidation of the school district itself. When a small town loses its school, it loses its civic center. The local economy dries up as families no longer visit the town center for games or events, real estate values for the remaining single-family homes stagnate, and the town transitions from a living community into a stagnant retirement village for isolated land managers. Let us look closer at the retail and civic institutions that depend on a balanced family demographic. Imagine the local main street of a town in rural Oklahoma or Kansas. A vibrant community requires a diverse velocity of money. Families buy groceries, purchase clothing, enroll children in extracurricular activities, and frequent local diners. When the family structure is fractured and the non-custodial parent and children leave, the local economic ecosystem suffers a permanent reduction in consumer demand. The local hardware store or seed dealer might survive because the large-scale agricultural operations still require parts and inputs, but the local boutique, the independent pharmacy, the grocery store, and the family restaurant face terminal revenue declines. The tax base of the county shrinks, leaving the local government with fewer resources to maintain basic infrastructure like road repairs, bridge maintenance, and volunteer fire departments. Furthermore, we must analyze the sociological concept of social capital within these shrinking communities. In a healthy rural environment, civic life is maintained through an intricate web of volunteerism. The Lions Club, the volunteer fire department, the library board, and youth sports leagues are all run by parents who have a vested stake in the future of the community for the sake of their children. When divorce drives a wedge through families and forces the relocation of active parents, the institutional memory and volunteer capacity of these organizations vanish. The remaining aging population lacks the physical stamina or the long-term motivation to sustain these civic structures. The social fabric becomes brittle, leaving the individuals who remain increasingly isolated and disconnected from one another. This brings us to a dark and deeply unsettling dimension of the rural divorce journey, one that is rarely spoken of in polite conversation, but is meticulously documented in public health data. What happens to the men who are left behind in this aging, isolated monoculture? When the noise of a family vanishes from a farmhouse, replaced by a crushing silence and the overwhelming weight of multi-million-dollar agricultural debt, the psychological toll can be catastrophic. In the next part of this masterclass, we will confront the hidden mental health crisis of the rural divorce journey, uncovering the systemic barriers to psychological care, the cultural mandates of toxic self-reliance, and the alarming historical trends of the silent epidemic sweeping through the men of the American heartland. To understand the full scale of this silent crisis, we must first dismantle the cultural architecture of rural masculinity. For generations, the agrarian myth has celebrated the archetype of the completely self-reliant, stoic American producer. In this sociological framework, a man's worth is directly tied to his capacity to endure physical hardship, absorb financial risk without complaint, and maintain an unyielding exterior regardless of internal turmoil. While this cultural conditioning fosters immense resilience against environmental and economic adversity, historical trends indicate that it transforms into a profound psychological trap when a marriage collapses. In these communities, admitting to emotional trauma, depression, or an inability to cope with the dissolution of one's family is widely internalized as an admission of fundamental failure as a man, a provider, and a community leader. Let us examine how this psychological weight compounds in the current year of 2026 through a representative case study. Consider a 42-year-old livestock producer named Mark, who manages a third-generation cattle operation in South Dakota. After his wife departs the marital home and relocates with their children to a metropolitan area 2 states away, Mark is left completely alone on a homestead that requires 14 hours of intense physical labor every single day. In an urban environment, a person experiencing this level of profound displacement might find brief moments of reprieve through a diverse array of social distractions or specialized support groups. For Mark, however, every square inch of his environment serves as a constant, painful reminder of the family unit that has been dismantled. The empty bedrooms, the quiet kitchen table, and the vacant passenger seat of his truck become sources of chronic, low-grade psychological trauma. The structural conditions of his livelihood actively prevent him from processing this grief in a healthy manner. Cattle ranching does not stop for a domestic crisis. The fences must still be repaired, the livestock must still be fed, and the volatile commodity markets must still be navigated. Mark cannot take a 2-week leave of absence for mental health stabilization without risking the immediate physical and financial collapse of his entire operation. Consequently, he resorts to the only coping mechanism validated by his cultural conditioning: overwork. He channels his emotional pain into extreme physical exertion, attempting to exhaust himself to the point of numbness. Case studies show that this cycle of chronic sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, and unaddressed emotional distress rapidly degrades executive functioning, leaving individuals highly vulnerable to escalating secondary crises, including substance abuse and severe clinical depression. This vulnerability is dramatically intensified by the absolute lack of accessible mental health infrastructure in rural spaces. If Mark were to overcome the cultural stigma and actively seek professional psychological support, the geographic and institutional barriers he would face are almost insurmountable. A significant percentage of rural U.S. counties are officially designated by federal agencies as mental health professional shortage areas. In Mark's county, there is not a single licensed psychiatrist, clinical psychologist, or marriage and family therapist. The nearest behavioral health clinic is located in a regional city 85 miles away, creating the same logistical and financial friction we explored in the legal context. Furthermore, the lack of anonymity acts as a major deterrent to seeking care locally. In a small town, privacy is non-existent. If Mark drives his highly recognizable flatbed truck into the county seat and parks it outside the offices of the lone regional social service provider, the entire community will know within hours. The local gossip network does not distinguish between a routine therapy session and a severe psychological breakdown. For an agricultural producer whose business relies heavily on maintaining a reputation of absolute stability and competence with local bankers, equipment dealers, and buyers, the public perception of mental instability is an active economic liability. If the local agricultural lender perceives that a producer is cracking under the stress of a divorce, it can subtly influence their assessment of that producer's creditworthiness for the next operating line of credit, creating a direct financial penalty for prioritizing mental health. While telehealth platforms have expanded rapidly by 2026, offering a potential solution to this geographic isolation, they frequently fail to bridge the gap in rural communities. Large swaths of the rural United States still suffer from unreliable broadband infrastructure, making stable video consultations difficult to maintain. More importantly, the cultural resistance to digital intimacy remains high among older and traditional populations. A man socialized in an environment of physical labor and face-to-face transactions is historically unlikely to open up about deep-seated emotional trauma to a stranger on a laptop screen, especially when that stranger represents an urban, metropolitan culture that feels entirely disconnected from the realities of rural life. Left without institutional outlets, these men are forced to rely on informal, often highly destructive coping mechanisms. Historical trends indicate a sharp correlation between rural marital dissolution and escalating rates of alcohol abuse in resource-dependent communities. The local tavern or the isolation of the farmhouse kitchen becomes the primary site of self-medication. This substance reliance creates a dangerous, cascading set of potential outcomes. It impairs judgment, increases the likelihood of farm accidents, damages remaining family relationships, and severely complicates ongoing legal battles regarding child custody and asset division. John's attorney can easily weaponize Mark's escalating alcohol consumption in court, presenting it as definitive proof that he is an unfit custodian, thereby accelerating the loss of access to his children and locking him deeper into the cycle of despair. The true tragedy of this sociological phenomenon is that it occurs in absolute silence. Unlike urban communities where social crises are often visible and actively debated in public forums, the rural mental health crisis is hidden behind vast horizons, long driveways, and a cultural code of omerta. Neighbors may notice that a newly divorced producer is withdrawing from community events, that his fields are looking slightly neglected, or that his truck is parked outside the local bar more frequently, but the mandate of non-interference prevents them from breaking the silence. Everyone stays in their lane, respecting a privacy that has mutated into a lethal form of isolation. This systemic breakdown of the male psychological infrastructure represents the final, devastating stage of the rural divorce journey's immediate impact. It proves that the costs of marital failure in the heartland cannot be measured solely in dollars, cents, or acres of land. The true cost is extracted in human capital, in the slow, agonizing erosion of the individuals who form the backbone of the American food and resource supply chains. But as these individual lives fracture, and the demographic landscape shifts, a new, equally complex counter-narrative is beginning to emerge on the horizon. How are the women who are forced out of these communities rebuilding their lives from scratch in the cities? What happens when they attempt to leverage their unique agricultural knowledge in an urban corporate environment? And how do they fight back against the legal systems that strip them of their heritage? In the next part of this masterclass, we will follow the trajectory of the displaced rural workforce, exposing the underground economic networks modern women are constructing to survive, and the legislative battles being fought in 2026 to reform the biased property laws of the American West. This displacement into the urban landscape initiates a radical economic transformation, forcing individuals to translate specialized agrarian skill sets into the lexicon of modern metropolitan industries. For decades, historical trends suggested that when a spouse was forced out of a rural community, their economic trajectory was permanently depressed due to the sudden loss of land assets and localized social capital. However, case studies unfolding in the current year of 2026 reveal a profound counter-narrative. Displaced individuals are increasingly leveraging their deep, practical understanding of resource management, commodity cycles, and logistical coordination to carve out powerful niches within urban corporate structures. Consider the real-time case study of a woman named Amanda, who in early 2026 finalized a highly contentious divorce from a large-scale wheat and corn producer in eastern Colorado. Walked away with minimal liquid capital due to the intricate family trust structures we analyzed previously. Amanda relocated to the Denver metropolitan area. On paper, her formal resume featured an extended employment gap, categorized by traditional human resource metrics as decades of domestic dependency. The reality of her experience, however, was vastly different. For 20 years, Amanda had single-handedly managed the farm's compliance documentation for the United States Department of Agriculture, negotiated complex water right leases during severe drought cycles, coordinated the automated scheduling of multi-million-dollar grain elevator deliveries, and audited the fluctuating operating lines of credit with local agricultural lenders. When Amanda began interviewing in the urban corporate ecosystem, she did not frame her past as farm labor. Instead, she systematically retranslated her skills into corporate compliance, supply chain logistics, and risk management asset optimization. Imagine if an urban logistics firm is trying to navigate the volatile supply chains of modern food distribution. A corporate executive with an MBA understands the theory, but Amanda understands the exact physical and bureaucratic mechanisms that dictate how commodities move from a remote field to a global shipping port. By reframing her sweat equity into professional competencies, Amanda secured a senior logistics analyst position at a major multinational agribusiness firm headquartered in Denver. This transition demonstrates that the operational complexity of modern American agriculture equips displaced rural spouses with an elite, highly resilient operational intelligence that is exceptionally valuable to metropolitan industries dealing with supply chain volatility and resource scarcity. This economic migration has catalyzed the formation of sophisticated, underground economic networks designed to facilitate the survival and upward mobility of displaced rural workers. In 2026, these networks operate as decentralized digital collectives, completely bypassing traditional public social services. Founded by former rural spouses who successfully navigated the trauma of small-town displacement, these private platforms function as informal placement agencies, legal clearinghouses, and housing syndicates. When a vulnerable spouse realizes their marriage is untenable, they can securely connect with these networks to map out a strategic, step-by-step exit plan before their partner or the local community realizes a separation is imminent. The mechanics of these underground networks are exceptionally precise. If a spouse in a remote county faces a total legal desert and an absolute lack of local housing, the network steps in to stabilize the situation. Members within regional cities coordinate to provide immediate, temporary housing, eliminating the terrifying choice of remaining under a hostile roof or moving back into a high-surveillance parental home. Simultaneously, the network connects the relocating spouse with metropolitan family law attorneys who possess specialized expertise in forensic accounting and unmasking hidden agricultural wealth. These urban attorneys are not bound by the local social ties, country club memberships, or institutional biases that often compromise legal counsel within the rural circuit court systems. By matching a displaced spouse with an independent, aggressive legal defense, the network completely disrupts the traditional power imbalance, allowing the non-custodial parent to fight for equitable potential outcomes from a position of geographic and financial security. Furthermore, these networks act as powerful professional mentoring pipelines. Recognizing that traditional job application algorithms frequently penalize individuals with non-traditional rural backgrounds, the collective leverages its internal corporate connections to place arriving rural migrants directly into interview loops. They provide intensive boot camps on corporate terminology, technology integration, and urban financial systems, ensuring that the arriving workforce can immediately convert their operational agrarian knowledge into high-performing corporate roles. This collective infrastructure transforms what was once an isolated, devastating displacement into an organized, highly efficient pipeline of elite human capital moving from the countryside into the city. This economic and social reorganization in urban centers has fueled a major legislative counteroffensive across the American West in 2026. For over a century, the property and family laws of agricultural states have been heavily weighted toward the preservation of land continuity and the protection of multi-generational family entities. This statutory bias has historically allowed the primary landholding lineage to systematically devalue the contributions of marrying spouses through the weaponization of minority discounts and entity restrictions. Today, however, coalitions of displaced professionals, backed by progressive legal scholars and urban legislators, are mounting fierce battles in state capitals to fundamentally reform the marital property codes of states like Montana, North Dakota, and Colorado. At the heart of this 2026 legislative battle is the push for the Equitable Agricultural Asset Valuation Act, a model statute designed to eliminate the artificial valuation traps we explored in previous sections. If passed, this legislation would mandate that when a court evaluates a spouse's interest in a closely held family LLC or family limited partnership during a divorce, the standard valuation discounts for lack of marketability and lack of control would be completely prohibited if the entity's primary asset consists of agricultural real estate. Instead, the court would be legally required to value the marital share based strictly on the net asset value of the underlying land and equipment. The structural impact of this single statutory shift would be monumental. It would effectively prevent a wealthy farming lineage from using complex corporate paperwork to render a spouse's decades of shared labor worthless on paper. Furthermore, the proposed laws seek to create a statutory presumption that non-monetary operational and domestic labor on an agricultural enterprise carries an equal financial weight to direct capital contributions. This would force rural courts to recognize bookkeeping, logistics management, and household stewardship as an active, quantifiable investment in the acquisition of land equity, fundamentally shifting the baseline of potential outcomes for vulnerable spouses across the entire geographic expanse of the American heartland. Unsurprisingly, this legislative movement faces immense, heavily capitalized resistance from traditional rural power brokers. State farm bureaus, local banking associations, and multi-generational agricultural lobbying groups have mobilized massive campaigns to defeat these reforms. They argue that eliminating valuation discounts and forcing equitable cash buyouts will trigger a catastrophic fragmentation of the American food production system, compelling families to liquidate large-scale acreage, undermining local agricultural credit lines, and destroying the economic viability of the family farm institution. This creates a profound ideological and sociological standoff in 2026, a clash between the preservation of an ancient, land-based economic heritage and the fundamental civil rights of the individuals who sustain that heritage from within the domestic sphere. The battle lines are no longer confined to individual farmhouses or small-town courthouses. They are being drawn across the entire socio-political map of the United States, pitting the rising economic power of displaced urban migrants against the entrenched political dominance of the rural establishment. But as this legislative warfare escalates in the state capitals, a chilling and highly volatile dimension of the rural divorce journey continues to unfold in the dark corners of the countryside itself. What happens when the legal system fails to adapt quickly enough, and the intense social pressure, financial isolation, and psychological despair of a small-town separation push individuals past their breaking points? How do rural communities cope with the escalating undercurrent of domestic retaliation, extra-legal asset destruction, and the total breakdown of the rule of law when a family unit implodes under the absolute pressure of the agrarian matrix? In the next part of this masterclass, we will confront the darkest chapter of this sociological study, exposing the hidden history of rural domestic retaliation, the secret sabotage of agricultural infrastructure, and the systematic failures of small-town law enforcement to protect the vulnerable when the boundary between private grief and public rage completely dissolves. This breakdown of the boundary between private grief and public rage manifests as a distinct, highly destructive sociological phenomenon: the covert sabotage of agricultural infrastructure. In an urban or suburban setting, domestic retaliation during a high-conflict divorce typically takes the form of hidden bank accounts, liquidated credit cards, or the destruction of personal property like clothing or electronics. In a rural, resource-dependent economy, however, case studies reveal that retaliation routinely scales up to target the foundational means of production. When an individual realizes that the legal system may force the division or liquidation of their life's work, the psychological defense mechanism frequently shifts from asset preservation to scorched earth asset destruction. Let us analyze a highly detailed case study unfolding in the current year of 2026 to understand the sophisticated mechanics of modern rural sabotage. Consider a couple, Thomas and Brenda, who are undergoing a bitter separation in a highly automated, large-scale corn and soybean operation in Indiana. The farm leverages millions of dollars in precision agriculture technology, including autonomous tractors, GPS-guided planters, and synchronized digital irrigation networks. Thomas, facing the reality that a 2026 family court might award Brenda a significant percentage of the farm's equity or mandate a massive cash buyout, recognizes that he cannot easily hide the physical land. Instead, he shifts his strategy toward the covert dissipation of the farm's immediate operational value. In the weeks leading up to a crucial valuation audit, Thomas leverages his exclusive administrative access to the farm's fleet management software. He subtly alters the calibration codes on the GPS-guided seed drills, ensuring that when the automated planters hit the fields, they miscalculate the planting depth by a fraction of an inch and disrupt the optimal spacing metrics. To an outside observer or a court-appointed agricultural appraiser walking the property, the fields appear perfectly normal. However, beneath the soil, the crop potential has been systematically compromised. This calculated miscalibration ensures that the ultimate crop yield will experience a terminal decline, artificially depressing the farm's revenue for the year and rendering the operation functionally unprofitable on paper right when the court is evaluating its economic viability. The sophistication of this modern infrastructure sabotage extends deep into the physical components of the operation. Imagine a scenario where an estranged spouse takes advantage of the vast, unmonitored acreage of a rural property to execute untraceable property destruction. Case studies document instances where individuals introduce high-grade industrial contaminants into massive liquid fertilizer storage tanks, or introduce fine abrasive particulates into the hydraulic reservoirs of expensive harvesting combines. Because these machines operate under extreme physical pressure in high-dust environments, the introduction of a contaminant does not cause immediate, obvious failure. Instead, it triggers an accelerated, catastrophic internal erosion of the mechanical components over the subsequent months. By the time the combine engine seizes or the hydraulic lines fail, the destruction can be easily framed to an insurance adjuster or a divorce judge as a routine, albeit unfortunate, mechanical breakdown due to standard wear and tear. The non-custodial spouse is left watching as the shared marital wealth is systematically erased, with zero capacity to prove to a metropolitan-trained judge that the mechanical failure was actually a precise act of domestic economic warfare. This extra-legal warfare is rendered immensely successful due to the systematic failure of small-town law enforcement networks. In a major metropolitan area, if an individual experiences domestic stalking, property damage, or economic intimidation, the responding police officers are completely anonymous state actors. They file objective reports, log digital evidence into a centralized system, and operate within a rigid bureaucratic framework that minimizes personal discretion. In a rural county with a population of fewer than 3,000 people, the office of the county sheriff functions under an entirely different sociological matrix. The sheriff is not an anonymous bureaucrat. They are an elected politician whose continued tenure depends directly on the political and financial backing of the county's most prominent, long-standing families. If Brenda discovers that Thomas has sabotaged the equipment, or if she experiences a sustained campaign of physical intimidation designed to force her off the property, her attempts to secure protection from local law enforcement frequently run into an insurmountable wall of institutional collusion. When she calls the county sheriff's department, the responding deputy is often an individual who grew up with Thomas, played high school football with his brothers, or relies on his extended family for political endorsements during election cycles. Historical trends demonstrate that in these close-knit rural law enforcement circles, domestic calls are routinely minimized as private family matters that should be resolved behind closed doors, rather than through formal criminal charges. The deputy arrives at the scene, avoids filing an official police report, and engages in a process of informal mediation that systematically favors the status quo. They use coded language to pressure Brenda into compliance, suggesting that pursuing formal charges for property destruction or harassment will ruin Thomas's reputation, cause the local bank to revoke the farm's line of credit, and ultimately harm her own children's future. If Brenda insists on filing a formal complaint, the paperwork is frequently delayed, improperly logged, or subjected to intense internal skepticism. This institutional gaslighting leaves the vulnerable spouse completely defenseless, effectively locked out of the criminal justice system by a localized buddy-buddy network that views any disruption of a prominent family unit as an existential threat to the stability of the entire community. The consequences of this law enforcement breakdown are catastrophic for the ongoing family law case. Without official, timely police reports, Brenda's legal counsel cannot present a credible, documented history of domestic intimidation or asset dissipation to the circuit court judge. In the eyes of a judge located miles away in a regional hub, the lack of police records indicates that no significant misconduct has occurred. Thomas's legal team can then frame Brenda's claims of sabotage and harassment as hysterical, unfounded fabrications designed to bias the court, completely reversing the roles of victim and perpetrator. The rural legal desert and the law enforcement matrix align perfectly to lock the vulnerable individual into a state of total isolation, where survival requires either absolute submission to an inequitable financial settlement or a sudden, uncoordinated flight from the geographic boundaries of the county with no assets to their name. This systematic erasure of the rule of law within the rural domestic sphere reveals that the true boundary of the American heartland is not marked by geographic borders, but by an invisible, impenetrable wall of social custom and institutional self-preservation. When the internal friction of a failing marriage meets the rigid, unyielding structures of a resource-dependent community, the potential outcomes are dictated not by statutory justice, but by raw social capital and the capacity to endure isolation. But what happens when this entire multi-layered cycle reaches its absolute conclusion? When the assets have been devalued, the children have been geographically divided, the local institutions have chosen their sides, and the legal battles in the state capitals have run their course, what is the ultimate legacy left behind in the soil? In the next part of this masterclass, we will step back to evaluate the long-term generational inheritance of the rural divorce journey, exposing the hidden rise of fractured land ownership webs, the ultimate economic destabilization of the American food supply chain, and the profound ways the collapse of the rural family unit is redrawing the cultural map of the entire United States. The fragmentation of land ownership webs represents a permanent, structural distortion of the American geographic legacy, transforming unified agricultural tracts into tangled legal nightmares. When a marriage dissolves without a clean financial buyout, the legal system frequently resorts to creating undivided fractional interests to satisfy equitable distribution requirements. Imagine a situation in the current year of 2026 involving a character named William, whose family has cultivated 600 acres of highly productive bottomland in Ohio for 3 generations. Following a complex divorce proceeding where the court seeks to balance the equities without forcing an immediate, catastrophic liquidation of the real estate, the circuit judge issues a decree transforming the property into a tenancy in common. William retains a 60% undivided interest, while his ex-spouse receives a 40% undivided interest. On paper, the physical boundaries of the farm remain intact, avoiding the immediate trauma of a public auction. In reality, this legal mechanism introduces a state of permanent operational gridlock that systematically destroys the long-term economic viability of the asset base. Local agricultural lenders view fractional ownership between hostile ex-spouses as an extreme, unmitigated credit risk. When William attempts to renew his annual operating line of credit to secure seed, fuel, and fertilizer for the upcoming planting season, the banking institution requires all parties holding an undivided interest in the collateral real estate to execute the mortgage security agreements. If his ex-spouse refuses to sign, choosing to leverage her fractional ownership to force a total liquidation or an inflated cash payout, the credit pipeline is instantly severed. William cannot secure the necessary capital to plant his crops, forcing him to let highly productive fields lie fallow or lease the acreage to competing corporate operations at a severely depressed rate. Historical trends indicate that these fractured ownership webs quickly accumulate across generations, mutating into highly volatile heirs' property dilemmas. If either party passes away or transfers their fractional shares to distant relatives who have no connection to the land, a single farm can become owned by dozens of individuals scattered across the United States. Any single shareholder can file a petition lawsuit, forcing a judicial sale of the entire property on the open market. This legal vulnerability strips the land of its value as collateral, rendering it functionally useless for traditional family farming, and turning the geographic heritage of the family into a source of endless, costly litigation. Operational paralysis at the individual farm level scales up exponentially to threaten the broader stability of the American food supply chain. Modern food security relies on a highly predictable, capital-intensive network of independent producers who possess the financial stability to make long-term investments in soil health, advanced technology, and infrastructure. When a significant percentage of these operations are locked in multi-year valuation disputes or post-divorce financial remediation, the wider agricultural economy experiences a profound capital freeze. Imagine if thousands of large-scale producers across the Midwest simultaneously halt their capital expenditures because their assets are subject to domestic court injunctions. They stop purchasing advanced precision machinery, cancel orders for localized irrigation infrastructure, and minimize their expenditures on advanced crop protection inputs. The ripple effects move rapidly down the supply chain, impacting everything from local equipment dealerships to regional grain elevators. Equipment dealerships face sudden inventory surpluses, forcing layoffs and reducing local tax revenues. Regional grain elevators experience unpredictable volume fluctuations, making it difficult to fulfill long-term delivery contracts with multinational food processors. Case studies from major agricultural corridors show that when an operation is bogged down by domestic litigation, management quality sharply deteriorates. The internal stress of the divorce distracts the primary operator from executing precise market hedges, monitoring pest infestations, or maintaining strict biosecurity protocols in large-scale livestock facilities. A single outbreak of disease in a neglected swine facility or a field consumed by unmanaged blight due to parental distraction does not remain confined to a single property. It poses a systemic biosecurity risk to adjacent farms, proving that the domestic instability of the rural family unit directly compromises the macroeconomic security of the nation's agricultural output. Concurrently, this systemic fragmentation accelerates a radical realignment of the cultural and political map of the United States. For over a century, the social stability of the American heartland was anchored by the cultural mythos of the unbroken, multi-generational farming family. This demographic unit was viewed as the ultimate custodian of traditional agrarian values, civic responsibility, and local heritage. As the structural realities of rural divorce systematically dismantle these family units, the vacuum is rapidly filled by institutional capital. When a family farm is fractured by a divorce decree, and neither party possesses the liquid resources to buy out the other, the only viable potential outcome is often a forced sale to an outside buyer. Corporate agricultural syndicates, sovereign wealth funds, and institutional real estate investment trusts sit waiting for these exact moments of domestic vulnerability. They step into the local market with massive liquid capital reserves, purchasing the fractured parcels and consolidating them into vast, industrialized corporate landholdings managed by non-resident entities. This transformation replaces the traditional family owner with an anonymous corporate tenant coordinator, erasing the local autonomy of the community. The political and social alignment shifts from a network of independent, land-owning civic participants to an economy dominated by low-wage agricultural laborers and distant corporate executives. The cultural identity of the small town, once rooted in the continuity of family lineages tied to specific plots of soil, dissolves into an industrialized landscape where the land is treated purely as an extraction mechanism for corporate shareholders. The profound sense of place that defined rural America is replaced by a pervasive sense of displacement, as the descendants of the original homesteaders are relegated to mere spectators in a landscape their ancestors spent generations clearing and cultivating. This masterclass has systematically exposed the invisible structural traps, the financial weaponization, the institutional biases, and the macro-demographic collapses that define the modern rural divorce journey. We have seen how geography, law, and culture combine to penalize those who dare to alter the traditional marital fabric of the American heartland. But our sociological investigation is not yet complete. Having mapped the absolute depth of this systemic crisis, we must now turn our attention to the ultimate synthesis. In the final concluding part of this deep dive masterclass, we will unlock the definitive path forward, revealing the radical structural interventions, the emergence of pioneering legal frameworks, and the underground resilient strategies modern individuals are utilizing to completely rewrite the rules of survival and reclamation in the American countryside. This systemic evolution of survival mechanisms brings us to the cutting edge of the contemporary agrarian landscape, where the necessity of reclamation has birthed a revolutionary legal discipline, collaborative agrarian family law. Historical trends indicated that traditional adversarial litigation invariably resulted in the economic fragmentation of the enterprise, or the complete social banishment of the non-custodial spouse. In the current year of 2026, a pioneering network of legal scholars and agricultural economists is actively dismantling this destructive binary. They are introducing highly sophisticated, mediation-first legal frameworks designed explicitly to decouple the dissolution of a romantic partnership from the structural destruction of an agricultural livelihood. Let us analyze the operational mechanics of this new framework through a highly detailed 2026 case study involving a character named Clara, who is navigating the termination of a 22-year marriage on a large-scale dairy and poultry operation in Wisconsin. Under traditional legal practices, Clara's options would be catastrophically limited: demand an immediate property appraisal and force a liquidation of the multi-million-dollar processing facilities, or capitulate to a substandard cash settlement that compromises her long-term financial independence. Instead, Clara's legal counsel leverages an emerging model known as the structured revenue equity payout. The step-by-step execution of this model represents a masterclass in modern financial engineering. Rather than treating the farm as a single indivisible asset that must be valued and split instantly, the collaborative framework treats the enterprise as a continuous, dynamic cash flow engine. Forensic accountants and agricultural consultants work together to isolate specific, non-operational revenue streams that can be diverted to the departing spouse without undermining the farm's primary operating line of credit. In Clara's case, the farm had recently entered into long-term commercial land leases for a utility-scale solar array and a network of wind turbines situated on the peripheral acreage of the property. The collaborative divorce decree structures a permanent legal assignment of these green energy revenues directly to Clara, providing her with a highly predictable, inflation-adjusted, and asset-backed income stream that ensures her complete financial autonomy. Simultaneously, the core agricultural acreage, the dairy herds, and the processing infrastructure remain completely unencumbered by debt or forced liquidation, allowing her ex-spouse to maintain the operational continuity of the food production facility and preserve the multi-generational inheritance for their children. This legal innovation is immediately supported by a parallel movement addressing the acute rural housing scarcity through the establishment of regional agrarian land trusts. Imagine if the primary barrier to leaving an untenable marriage was not a lack of legal representation, but the literal absence of a safe physical structure to inhabit within your children's school district. To eliminate this geographic trap, nonprofit trusts and progressive agricultural cooperatives in 2026 are utilizing private capital and municipal bonds to acquire underutilized historic buildings, vacant Main Street storefronts, and defunct farmsteads. These properties are systematically retrofitted into high-quality, modern residential units, specifically reserved for individuals undergoing domestic transitions. The sociological impact of these land trusts is profound. By providing an immediate, localized housing alternative, they effectively neutralize the geographic weaponization of school district boundaries. A separating parent like Clara no longer faces the forced choice of remaining in a hostile environment or fleeing 60 miles away to a metropolitan hub. She can transition into a secure, dignified residence less than 10 minutes away from her children's classrooms and her primary place of employment. This spatial proximity preserves the status quo of joint parenting schedules, completely neutralizing the logistical friction of long-distance highway custody exchanges. Furthermore, because these land trust developments are managed by independent, non-resident boards, they operate as zones of absolute privacy, insulating the arriving residents from the intrusive surveillance and social ostracization of the small-town gossip economy. Concurrently, the traditional toxic mandates of agrarian stoicism are being systematically dismantled from within by pioneering peer-to-peer psychological networks. Recognizing that rural men experiencing marital dissolution face severe barriers to traditional clinical care, independent agricultural associations are funding stealth mental health delivery systems. These programs completely reject the conventional architecture of a clinical office which acts as a beacon for small-town scrutiny. Instead, they integrate licensed family therapists directly into the natural gathering spaces of the rural economy. Mental health professionals are deployed to agronomic workshops, livestock auctions, grain elevator management seminars, and local volunteer fire department training sessions. The interactions are informal, confidential, and completely stripped of clinical stigma. A producer experiencing profound isolation or severe situational depression can engage in meaningful therapeutic dialogues disguised as routine business consultations or community organizing. These networks also leverage encrypted, low-bandwidth digital platforms designed specifically to function on unreliable rural internet networks, offering anonymous, 24-hour peer support groups where individuals can share coping strategies, legal survival tips, and emotional validation without fearing the loss of their local reputation or their creditworthiness with agricultural lenders. The emergence of these legal, spatial, and psychological innovations proves that the American heartland is not a static, dying landscape incapable of adaptation. It is a battleground where a new generation of rural citizens is actively fighting to redefine the parameters of community, justice, and survival. The rural divorce journey, while still inherently painful and structurally complex, is transitioning from a mechanism of total individual erasure into a catalyst for profound systemic evolution. By forcing the legal system to recognize non-monetary sweat equity, by constructing localized housing infrastructure, and by normalizing the prioritization of mental health, these communities are slowly but surely building a more resilient, equitable social matrix. This comprehensive 10-part sociological deep dive has unmasked the invisible forces that govern the intimate lives of the individuals who feed and fuel the United States. We have exposed the weaponization of agricultural debt, the legal deserts that trap the vulnerable, the institutional biases of small-town surveillance, the geographic warfare of rural custody disputes, and the macro-demographic collapses that threaten the very survival of modern rural municipalities. This masterclass has stripped away the superficial myths of the countryside, replacing them with a rigorous, data-driven understanding of human relationships under the extreme pressures of resource dependency. But as the traditional family structures of the heartland adapt to these modern realities, a massive, far more volatile transformation is beginning to accelerate across the broader geographic expanse of the nation. The rewriting of marital property laws and the redistribution of land equity are sending shockwaves through the entire financial architecture of the American West, triggering an unprecedented real estate crisis that reaches far beyond the boundaries of the farm. Who are the powerful institutional forces capitalizing on this domestic fragmentation? And how is the collapse of the independent producer clearing the path for a total corporate takeover of the nation's natural resources? The transformation of the family unit is merely the first domino in a global economic realignment. Our investigation into the hidden mechanics of modern society continues, and the true scale of the corporate land grab is about to be completely exposed.